Hey everyone, thank you for joining me for my presentation today. I'm really excited to share some of this new material with you. This is related to a new book that I'm working on about Jesse Ed Davis. And my paper for today is titled Washita Love Child, The Life and Times of Jesse Ed Davis. I'm a little nervous because this is my first time really sharing this material in sort of a larger public venue. And the material is really personal for me in a lot of respects. It's something that I care about deeply and I feel very close to it. I've been collecting records since my earliest memories, going back until I was 4 years old. I think I bought my first 45 with my own allowance money. But even before that, I got into my mom and dad's record collection. And I was sort of raised on FM radio and MTV and rock and roll music. So this is really important stuff to me. Moreover, I bring 15 years of experience as a working musician to this project, which is now, delivered from my current position as a professor of Native American history at Oklahoma State University. So there's a lot going on in this work that I feel very connected to, and I hope that you like it. Think of what follows as sort of a preview for a film, if you will. It's just some snapshots, impressions, or riffs, I suppose, pun intended, on the longer book that I've been working on for about a year and a half. And yeah, I'm ready to share with you now. So let me share my screen here and get you some pictures to guide us along this journey here. Okay. No one played like Jesse Ed Davis. The guitar slinger, pianist, writer, arranger, and producer from Oklahoma. His singular and expansive contributions to rock and roll, blues, country, and pop music grace over 100 albums, and he can be heard on countless classic rock stations today. From his first major session in 1965 on Gary Lewis and the Playboys' Everybody Loves a Clown, until his death from a heroin overdose at 4:40 p.m., June 22nd, 1988, at the young age of 43. Davis played on the biggest records and stages with the greatest musicians of his era, including Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and 3 of the Beatles. That's his majestic playing on Ex-Bird, Gene Clark's influential No Other. That's his seductive guitar on Rod Stewart's #1 hit, Tonight's the Night. That's him backing George Harrison and covering for an ailing Eric Clapton at the famed 1971 concert for Bangladesh in Madison Square Garden. Playing guitar and piano and arranging horn parts, he was such an instrumental force on Taj Mahal's beloved first 4 albums that Taj himself often called the group the Davis Band. Jesse's playing on Taj Mahal's classic update on Blind Willie McTell's Statesboro Blues inspired Duane Allman to learn slide guitar, before becoming widely regarded as the greatest bottleneck slide player to ever walk the earth. Here's one more. In 1973, Mick Jagger had Jesse waiting in LA, literally with his bags packed, and ready to join the Rolling Stones on the road to support Goat's Head Soup, before Keith Richards escaped a 25-count drug bust with a 250-pound fine in the nick of time. The legends are legion. That's one way to begin this story. Jesse Ed Davis was also Native American, and although he might expect otherwise, from Norman to Oklahoma City to Los Angeles to London, his indigeneity was never compromised and rarely commodified, not because he hid it, but because it was so fundamental to who he was and where he came from. Indeed, here's another way to begin his story, the way he sang it, which went like this. I was born on the bank of the Washita River in a Kiowa-Comanche teepee. Daddy had a hard time. Mama made his eyes shine. Lord, it was just us three. I tied my hair back. I did that powwow thing. Daddy showed up with a Stella guitar, and I knew right then I believed. There's only a hint of creative license. Jesse Edwin Davis III, or Eddie, as his family affectionately called him, partly to distinguish him from his father, Jesse Edwin Davis II, was born in the Navy Veterans Hospital in Norman, Oklahoma. The rest is true. Jesse did believe in rock and roll. He wrote it, sang it, produced it, played it, and lived it until one day, in his telling, the circus left town. In his remarkable career, Davis accompanied American music heroes and held court with British rock royalty. Of course, this arrangement is ripe for critical analysis. Right. These folks were probably enamored with the opportunity to pal around with a real live Indian from Oklahoma. But indigeneity, or at least Indianness, certainly was valuable currency in a counterculture that thought erecting a teepee in the backyard, as the Grateful Dead did in Haight-Ashbury, was a groovy thing to do. Years after moving to California, Jesse himself looked back on Oklahoma City as a quote-unquote six-gun city. It's still the Wild West back there. It's really provincial, he told a radio DJ. He understood how being indigenous might comfortably or uncomfortably fit within shifting contexts. But from swinging London to sunny Los Angeles, Jesse Ed Davis was no mascot or captive, and not even a diplomat or sojourner. In fact, he was an insider and key collaborator. And most striking about the life, character, and career of Jesse Ed Davis is his apparent immunity to standard analytical tropes that drive 20th century Native American history. Against the backdrop of the Red Power movement and the 1973 Wounded Knee occupation, the year his third album saw release, precisely when he could have cashed in as a voice of the Red Power generation, an icon for indigenous sovereignty rights, he did the opposite. He doubled down on his identity as a rock star, living and producing all the glamorous and not so glamorous scenes it conjures. But if his music wasn't the soundtrack for the 1972 Bureau of Indian Affairs takeover, then it was the soundtrack for a different kind of indigenous takeover in the 1960s and 70s that unfolded in the context of 20 years of urban relocation, returning indigenous Vietnam veterans, the racialization of Native people as a minority group within Johnson's Great Society, a federal shift to a tribal self-determination policy, and an expanding generation of young indigenous peoples who attended major colleges and universities and gradually broke into the American middle class. Like them, Jesse Ed Davis was always Indian, always Kiowa, whether he traded it as cultural currency or not. And everything he did was Indian, because Jesse was Indian, and he knew it, and so did everyone around him. Exceptional as he was, he remained familiar to other indigenous people, including future generations. Acclaimed seminal director Sterling Harjo's 2015 film Miko, including a stirring scene in which several homeless Native people dance in a Tulsa tavern to the soundtrack of Davis's vibrant tune Keep Me Comin', is resonant proof of this. It's not surprising that he became a folk hero to Native people, from the Red Power generation to young kids picking up a guitar today. If his words and music didn't obviously reflect watershed activist events, then they reflected a different set of indigenous experiences, ones that were a little more Saturday night in the city than Monday morning on the res, and perhaps filled with a little more joy than pain. Every night is Saturday night, a cut from his debut album insists. When Jesse performed with Santee Dakota poet and activist John Trudell in their cutting-edge graffiti band in the 1980s, he would introduce himself by saying, "Hello, I'm Jesse Ed Davis, and I'm real proud to be Indian." And he had a reason to be proud, but he probably also felt he had something to prove. His remarkable family story is filled with prominent Native American people who characterized the many different paths Indigenous people took towards surviving the onslaught of violent colonization of the 19th century American West. Into the 20th century, his ancestors reflected the ways Native people rebuilt their families, homes, communities, and nations through profound sacrifice and bold ingenuity. Among his direct ancestors from his father's side is the 19th century Comanche chief Ten Bears, who led his people in both treaty making and military defense of indigenous ancestral lands, once even leading a counterattack against the US in retaliation for the invading nation's assault on a band of Kiowas, Jesse's mother's people. He also descends from famous but controversial Comanche chief Quanah Parker, who successfully led his people in the Red River War against the invading United States, before becoming a railroad and cattle entrepreneur and close friend of Teddy Roosevelt. Alice Brown Davis, Jesse's great-great-grandmother from the Tiger clan, prominent for producing leaders, served as the first female chief of the Seminole Nation and led her people through the disastrous allotment policy and the Great Depression. His grandfather, William Graham Davis, worked in Hollywood and built the staircase Scarlett O'Hara descended in Gone with the Wind. On his mother's side, Jesse's grandfather, Jasper Sankey, was one of the most prominent leaders of the Kiowa Nation in the 20th century, guiding his people as tribal chairman during the Great Depression and Indian New Deal, while also serving as a U.S. Marshal. He did this from Oklahoma City, where he and his family relocated in 1933, 2 decades prior to the federal urban relocation program that moved Native people to cities for work, social, and education opportunities, with mixed results. Eddie Davis's father, Jesse Edwin Davis II, known by the nickname Bus, was a World War II Navy veteran. This is also true of Eddie's grandfather, William Graham Davis, and his uncle Madison, or Dutch, who all carried on the tradition of Eddie's great-grandfather, Jesse Edwin Davis I, who served in the Navy in World War I. In time away from his day job as a graphic design specialist at Tinker Air Force Base, Bus passed long hours in his studio behind the Davis house, where, using his Comanche name Running Wolf, he produced prize-winning paintings that showed around the country. His mural work can still be seen in the Oklahoma State Capitol today. And when not painting, Bus moonlighted as a Dixieland jazz drummer and trombonist who performed at jazz clubs in Oklahoma City. Eddie's cousin, Rashenda Davis Bates, recalls that the Davis home on Casper Drive in northeast Oklahoma City was like a jazz club unto itself, and a record store. Reflecting on his own record collection, recalling the huge record collection his parents maintained, Jesse said, "I think we've got more money tied up in records than anything else." The Dixieland music, otherwise known as traditional New Orleans jazz, that Eddie Davis heard his father play, stayed with him when, for example, he recruited New Orleans music icon Dr. John to perform on his second album. Or, well, just listen to his third album, Keep Me Coming, from 1973. It's soaked in Southern horns, arranged by Davis himself. Eddie's mother's story is equally impressive. Friends called Vivian Sankey Mamacita, and family called her B. Everyone adored her, including Taj Mahal, who sometimes visited Oklahoma with Jesse. "One of the warmest human beings on the planet," he gushes. "I mean, seriously, an amazing person. Somebody showed me some pictures of her when she was a grass dancer back in the day. Absolutely stunning, so warm and friendly, such beautiful energy, all the time, every time." She was the first Kiowa woman to earn a BA from the University of Oklahoma, where she later became an alumni association leader. She was both a prominent person among Kiowa people and a visible leader within the Oklahoma City Indigenous community. Sort of a first call session player in her own right, news media and Oklahoma City business leaders often recruited her to represent the state's large Indian population at public events and ceremonies. Once, in support of a war bond drive, she conducted a comedy routine with Bob Hope, in which she adopted him into the Kiowa Nation with a war bonnet and the name Chief Eaglebeak. As a boy, quite literally following in his father's footsteps, Eddie performed at powwows as a straight dancer, a Southern Plains style that grew out of traditional war dances. In his first marriage to a Seminole woman from East Los Angeles named Rosemarie Tantaleo Sants, Jesse and Tantaleo wore Jesse's grandfather Jasper Sonkey and grandmother Anna Pulaw Sonkey's ceremonial buckskin clothing and headdress and headband from their wedding ceremony 50 years prior. Jesse Ed Davis and his family and ancestors had to think quickly, critically, courageously, and creatively about how to survive and belong as Indigenous people in rapidly shifting cultural arenas, where they were often met with non-Indigenous people's strange ideas about who, what, where, and when Native people were and were not supposed to be. His family history is extraordinary, and these are just the greatest hits. His cousin, Mary Helen Deere, tells me Eddie's grandparents told him to always be proud of being Indian. He probably didn't have to try that hard. But he also probably felt great pressure to build on his family's achievements. In this, Jesse Ed Davis triumphed. Not long after picking up a $10.95 Stella guitar slung around his shoulder with a rope, he was playing Jimmy Reed and Elvis Presley in front of the mirror. And then OKC barbecue joints, fraternity parties, high school dances, and more. Let me pause for a second here to play you just a few seconds of something that I'm guessing most of you, maybe all of you, have never heard, and perhaps most of you don't know that this even existed. So Jesse had a band in late high school, early college years that's name changed over time from the Continentals to Joe Banana and the Bunch. They have a very appealing sound. And finally, they took the name The New Breed when they went to a little studio in Oklahoma City to cut their first 45. Just Another Bird Dog, written and produced by Jesse Ed Davis himself. Let me turn the camera here, and I'm going to play you just a couple seconds of this because I had to buy this record from Norway, and it cost me $100. And this here is not so much a record player as a record scratcher, so I don't condone this, but let me play you a few seconds so you can hear this. Certainly fits in with the sounds of the era. He's just another bird dog. Just another bird dog. I'm the man who really loves you. Up the street from his house, he could be found standing front row at the Spring Lake Amusement Park, where he studied Mohawk guitarist and future Bob Dylan bandmate Robbie Robertson's left hand when the Hawks came to town. He earned major chops when he hit the road as a teenager on a 33-date Dick Clark American Bandstand tour with rockabilly star Conway Twitty. Barnstorming places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and watching their van burn from the side of the road after it caught fire on the Tulsa Turnpike. He could pick things up quickly by ear, his high school pal Jim Layton recalls, and that prepared him for a future as a studio session ace. To avoid the draft, he enrolled in the University of Oklahoma's English program, planning to become a teacher. But rock and roll kept calling. He daydreamed in class all day, and before long dropped out and split for LA. And in certain ways, from Will Rogers to Maria Tallchief to Woody Guthrie, this is a familiar Oklahoma story. Apart from his grandfather, Bill Graham Davis, with whom he initially stayed in Silver Lake, Ed, sometimes Indian Ed, as his new friends began calling him, there were a few Eds in the group, only knew one person when he arrived in LA, Arkansan drummer Levon Helm, who had just dropped out of his own program, Bob Dylan's 1965 electric tour that was being chased around the United States by a plague of booze. Helm introduced Ed to other Okies. In fact, the LA music scene was overrun with Okies, camped out at Leon Russell's Sky Hill studio and Gary, Colonel Sanders, and Jimmy Carstein's plantation, where Ed briefly stayed. Oh, Oklahoma's lonesome cowboys are turned on in Tinseltown, Leon sang. Ed fell right in, playing with Levon Helm, Jimmy Carstein, Junior Markham, and John Ware in the collective known as the Tulsa Review, and with Leon Russell and Jim Keltner as the Tulsa Tops. He became a contributing architect of the Tulsa Sound, birthed in the Hollywood Hills of all places. One night, Walking Blues archive Taj Mahal, looking for a guitarist to form a new group, caught Ed playing solo at the Topanga Corral out in the canyon. Taj, Ed, brother Chuck Blackwell and Gary Gilmore, also from Oklahoma, formed the first and classic lineup of the Taj Mahal Band, whose first 3 albums, Taj Mahal, The Natural Blues, and Giant Step, enjoy a wide reputation as being among the best in the blues rock canon. In 1968, the Rolling Stones flew the band to London to perform alongside them as part of a film concert event called the Rock and Roll Circus, which also featured The Who, John Lennon, and Eric Clapton. And 2 years later, Ed Davis had left Taj's band, and with Clapton's support, embarked on a solo career, supported by an album and production deal, Washita Productions, with the hip Atco label. The rest is history. Jesse's solo albums sold poorly. In the high hundreds, he once quipped. Or maybe he was serious. But his reputation as a brilliant session guitarist launched him to the top of the business, where he made triple scale through the Musicians Union as a first call guitarist for the hottest stars in the business, playing alongside other session pros such as Danny Korchmar, Russ Kunkel, and Lee Sklar. He got a place at 20 Hurricane Street in Marina del Rey, where he lived across the alley from Vietnam veteran Ron Kovic, who was working on his famous book, Born on the 4th of July, and about 30 steps from the beach with his long-term girlfriend, Patty Daly, his golden son, Goddess, and her son, Billy Noriega, who enjoyed playing backgammon at the house with Ringo Starr. Billy and Jesse shared a father-son relationship, with Jesse claiming Billy as his own. There was great love between them, mixed with hard discipline. Billy could never meet Jesse's approval when he played the Pearl drum kit Jesse bought him. At the height of his powers, Jesse cut tracks for his guitar heroes, Albert King and John Lee Hooker, backed George Harrison at the 1971 concert for Bangladesh, survived John Lennon's Lost Weekend, and joined the decadent Rod Stewart and the Faces on the road in 1975. This came with sex, drugs, and rock and roll hedonism virtually written into the contract, as we should expect from young, rich, seemingly invincible rock stars. It all moved so fast. By the end of the decade, things had slowed down. Jesse's father had died, and Jesse was deep in the clutches of devouring drug and alcohol dependency. Seeking some sort of retreat, he landed in the enchanting town of Kailua, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, where he met his first wife, Tantaleo, while trying to win back his old girlfriend, Patty. His partner in crime, Gene Clark, one or both of them once drove Gene's Ferrari into the ocean, maybe on Thanksgiving. No one quite remembers the details. The ex-bird singer from southern Missouri, who claimed Native ancestry, was fighting his own addictions and career malaise and joined him there. Struggling to pay rent on his hillside abode overlooking the ocean, Jesse once desperately showed the landlord all of his albums, promising that he's good for the money when the next royalty check arrives. The dynamic duo sometimes played together in their ad hoc group Smoky Road to packed crowds at the local music club Anna Bananas. And Gene, with sorrow or pride, probably both, given his typical lyrical themes, referred to this mysterious period in their lives as the Great Abandonment. And whatever we call it, this is a familiar rock and roll story. The dawn of the new decade was especially rough on Jesse, beginning with the fifth of a series of tragic deaths of people he adored, including his keyboard player, Ray Eckstein, killed in a hamburger stand holdup, his recording engineer, Joe Zagarino, who died from a drug overdose, his songwriting partner and protege, John Angelo, Johnny Angel, who died from suicide, and his own father. But the next one broke whatever spirit remained. In his Dr. Winston O. Boogie alter ego, John Lennon used to phone Jesse from outer space. The night Lennon was gunned down in New York in December 1980, Jim Keltner and Jesse were together at a session Harry Nilsson was producing for Sylvester Stallone's brother Frank, if you can picture that. Not only was this the night Keltner lost his friend John Lennon, it was also the last time he ever saw his friend Jesse Ed Davis, essentially losing him too. "We got the news," Keltner told me. "It didn't make any sense. Everything went black. All I remember is no one said a word, and Jesse called for a car to pick him up. And when it arrived, it was a limo. It was the last time I ever saw Jesse." If Jesse didn't literally die that night like John, to Keltner he figuratively did. The next horrible thing after John was they found Jesse. And you know, I immediately thought, "Okay," Jesse said. "John went? Fuck it. I'm gone too." I have a feeling he gave up. In fact, Lennon's plan at the time of his death was to reform his solo band with Keltner, Jesse Ed, and Klaus Voormann. That Jesse could have reunited with Lennon in the 1980s when he was most in need of a career restart, only to lose him, must have been crushing. This is a powerfully human story, to be sure. Davis resurfaced in the mid-'80s and founded the graffiti band with famed activist John Trudell. "Only people like Lou Reed and John Doe can dream about doing work like this. Most don't have enough talent," Bob Dylan said about their AKA Graffiti Man collaboration, calling it the best album of 1986. Vietnam veteran Trudell had been a principal leader of the 1969 Indians of all tribes Alcatraz occupation. And Jesse didn't attend Alcatraz, but in a rare example of him acknowledging his indigenous identity, he did include a song about it on his second album, 1972's Ululu. Only, in another layer of irony, he didn't write it. Leon Russell did. Jesse and John met on May 1st, 1985 at LA's American Indian Eagle Lodge Rehabilitation Center, which incorporated indigenous culture into healing strategies. Hearing Trudell perform his spoken word poetry to backing tapes of traditional powwow music, Jesse told him he could put his music to poetry. Their mutual friend, Jackson Browne, helped jumpstart their career, and Jesse saw both a chance to get back on his feet and an opportunity to play music with a fellow Native artist. The music they made was explicitly activist, sometimes about specific indigenous people's issues, but more often in universal themes, such as nuclear environmental waste, that include it, but were not limited to Indian country. With lies for ancestors, there is no truth in some futures. Rulers of minds feeding next generation souls to the control machine, sacrifice ritual for the profit technology. Their song, Rich Man's War, goes. It's just vague enough to connect with a wider audience of people alarmed by the global environmental implications of Reagan's America. Working in concert with his blood brother, Trudell, earning a Grammy nomination, and reconnecting with old friends, Taj Mahal, George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Bonnie Bramlett, Nicky Hopkins, and others, Davis was poised for a comeback when he died from an overdose concoction of heroin, alcohol, and Librium, often prescribed to treat alcohol withdrawal, in his LA apartment laundry room on June 22nd, 1988. From the first moment I began working on this book, I've struggled with how to not let this become Jesse Ed Davis's story, because that falls into the waiting arms of a North American cultural industry that has made a killing by advancing stereotypes about Indigenous people and addiction, and fetishizing Indigenous pain and suffering. Maybe the answer lies in what the Mohawk musician Robbie Robertson said when I mentioned this. Doug, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. With that, how might we tell Jesse Ed Davis's story? How should we not tell it? Friends and family agree the end is a tragedy. How could it not be? Mark Shark, who played with Jesse in the graffiti band, still struggles to discuss the funeral, where Trudell stuck a few dollars and some tobacco in Jesse's pocket. Taj Mahal also struggles with it. I came down to Oklahoma, to the funeral home, to cuss him out in his casket. You cussed him out in his casket? I asked for clarification. Yep. Kelly went in and she had the place smudged. She had him all dressed real nice, laid out. I was so goddamn mad at him. You know, a major, beautiful player. But hey, like I say, I didn't walk in the man's moccasins. Most everyone remembers the last time they saw Jesse or answered his phone call, and these can be difficult memories. Another graffiti band partner, Ricky Eckstein, recalls a mutual acquaintance calling to tell him he just saw Jesse stumbling around Sunset Boulevard not long before he died. Hey, you're Jesse Ed Davis, he approached with excitement. I used to be, Jesse replied. But many hold on to his smile and magnetic charisma that he never lost, even in the deepest throes of addiction. Jackson Browne will never forget the last time he saw Jesse and all the poetic beauty of the moment. The last time I saw him, it had been raining, and then it stopped raining. So the streets were wet, and there were still droplets of rain being blown by the wind through the street. And he pulls up next to me at a light, and he's in a convertible. He must have just gotten in that car because it had only just stopped raining and the top was down. But he was sitting there, kind of bleary looking. To him, it was like the sun was shining on him. It was like you could see that he was in the weather, and he felt, well, it wasn't like it was cold. It wasn't like it was wet. He was in a convertible, and he smiled at me that amazing, like, hey, man, look at, and then the light turned, and he took off. And that was the last time I saw him. But he was probably on his way to cop. And that's the way I understand it. That's how he died. He just copped with somebody that gave him something too strong. I don't think he was defeated. Brown's poignant reflection evokes a song Jesse's old music partner Gene Clark wrote long before Jesse's death. I came to town on a Monday morning, the tall buildings breaking up the city sky. The streets were wet. It had just been pouring, like the clouds above the storm just had to cry. What about the beginning and the middle of the story? Those parts are almost harder to tell. It's not a cliche story of teenage rock and roll rebellion. His parents were too proud of him for that to stick. They once flew out to see him play a high-profile gig in Los Angeles, where Bonnie and Delaney Bramlett gave them cash for a hotel after their bank fumbled their traveler's checks. Eddie's mother and grandmother frequented Oklahoma City's Rainbow Records to make sure the Jesse Ed Davis bin was always stocked with his albums. Native people came from around Oklahoma to support him at a Taj Mahal concert he organized in Tulsa. Friends and family rode in a limo with him to the Faces August 1975 tour stop at Oklahoma City's Myriad Convention Center. Against what could Jesse rebel? Well, maybe there's something. He once mentioned that his parents were the first generation of Indian people assimilated into white society. Maybe he was referencing his upbringing in Oklahoma City, where he lettered in football, joined a literature club, played on the track and field team as a pole vaulter, and starred in theater productions as one of the only Native students at his middle upper class high school. While his family stayed connected with their tribal kin, they achieved comfort and success in the city years before the federal urban relocation program moved over 100,000 Native people to major cities, such as Los Angeles. Wherever he went, Jesse didn't talk much about being Indian, and I've struggled to understand why. I do, insists Robbie Robertson. It's because he wanted to be a part of a modern world. He wanted to be part of a newness, and I felt the same thing very early on. There was a long time I didn't want to talk about my heritage at all, because I got fucked over because of my heritage when I was young. I just let it alone. I just left it behind. My mother told me when I was growing up, be proud you're an Indian, but be careful who you tell. And so that was just something, even if it's a greater story that Ed had, he wanted to be part of this other world where that shit doesn't matter. Right. That's the promise of rock and roll. It's a place where you go and reinvent yourself. And California was a place where Oklahomans often went to reinvent themselves. And Native American history in the 20th century is significantly a story of reinvention. But which part of himself was Jesse trying to reinvent? Initially, he was apprehensive about signaling his indigenous identity. If you look at pictures of him, Taj Mahal explains, his hair gets longer by the year, and there's increasingly more jewelry and beads. You had the hippies living in teepees, people running around calling themselves Laughing Water, and I told him, hey man, if anyone has a right to be out here playing this music, it's you. You know, he had some stuff to work out from under. We're all buying Indian clothes, wearing Indian shoes, went Leon Russell and Mark Beno's song Indian Style, a session Jesse played on. In that context, perhaps the most radically or authentically Indian thing Jesse could do was not dress in buckskin. I was always a little weird anyway, being an Indian in Oklahoma, Jesse once said. Even the Taj Mahal band took the stage dressed like characters from a Cowboys and Indians movie. But then their interracial group didn't perform in red or blackface. Taj's own appearance was a tribute to black cowboys. And sometimes Jesse did wear buckskin, but so did Neil Young. And if Jesse's hair grew longer, well, just look around the late 1960s. It's hard to be certain where exactly Jesse was trying to fit in, but it was probably more than one place. Still, this is not a becoming Indian story either. Throughout his career, Jesse stayed connected with his family, including his close Kiowa cousin Russell Sonkey, who ventured to California with him. He referenced Native events in his live banter, like during a 1973 gig in Rochester, New York, where he said, "Everybody's hip to Wounded Knee now," before telling his audience about the 1868 Washita River Massacre. He performed benefit concerts for American Indian education programs. He played with Floyd Westerman, Charlie Hill, and Buffy St. Marie, three other Indigenous artists who redefined Native people's place in popular culture. He covered Leon's Alcatraz on his second album and made it his own. He worked at the American Indian Free Clinic in Compton, where he helped other Native people fighting addiction. He and his second wife, Kelly Brady, daughter of Wally Brady, who managed Frank Sinatra and produced The Bare Necessities for Disney's The Jungle Book, they were active members of the Orange County Powwow Club. Jesse and Kelly would often head down to the next local powwow on a Thursday and stay all weekend, with Jesse cooking pozole and fry bread for all his friends. His secret recipe involved using prepackaged Pillsbury biscuits. And of course, he played alongside Indigenous activists John Trudell and Quiltman in the Graffiti Band. And Trudell once suggested that Jesse was in some ways more of an activist than he was. He showed me that it's through art. That's what he showed me. We can be who we really are through art. But I imagine it had to be really hard to be an Indian trying to make it through that world. There were those who romanticized the Indians, and there are those who want to exploit it. In his own way, by being an artist, he had a very real political experience. Being Indian came naturally to Jesse, but he was no one's mascot. Some friends affectionately called him Indian Ed, but if he had exotic appeal to white musicians, it was just as much because he was an Okie as it was because he was Indian. Eric Clapton's embrace of the Tulsa Sound reflected his search for something authentically American, and he found it in Oklahoma. Besides, Jesse didn't suffer stereotypes. One time, a friend was in Jesse's kitchen in the Hurricane House, where Jesse was cooking up some food, and something caught on fire. Smoke filled the kitchen and billowed out the window. "What are you doing, Ed? Sending smoke signals?" his friend quipped. Jesse, calmly, expressionless, seemingly unconcerned about the fire, just turned and said, "No racial slurs." By that point, he had plenty of experience confronting racism, and not merely the soft version that came from otherwise adoring friends. He wrote about his experiences with racism growing up in Oklahoma City in a song titled Ching Ching China Boy that appeared on his third album. That's what school bullies used to call him when they taunt him following him home, assuming Jesse was Asian. The song climaxes with Jesse knocking the kid on his ass. Also back in Oklahoma, a teenage Jesse played in what was probably one of the first interracial rock and roll bands in the country, well before Sly and the Family Stone and Taj Mahal advanced that important development. Jesse's high school group, the Continentals, played around Oklahoma as well as Dallas, Texas. Beyond the integrated Esquire Club in Oklahoma City, however, their black singer, Carl Rogel, who would go on to sing with the Coasters of Yakety Yak fame, was not always welcome. "Jesse looked out for me," Rogel recalls. "He sheltered me from all that. But I realized in looking out for me, he was also looking out for himself, if that makes sense. He could see racism coming from a mile away." Rogel tells a story about dinner before a gig in Perry, Oklahoma, where a waitress came over and said, "I can't serve him," referring to Carl. "Whites only," she said, not seeming to mind Jesse's very visibly Indian presence. "White?" Jesse asked. "Yes," she replied. Jesse grabbed his glass of milk, poured it all over the counter, and said, "How do you like this, white?" Jesse Ed Davis was not a race artist, friend and Apache musician Robbie Romero insists. He was a musician who was Native American. The latter was important, but it didn't define his career. When I'm thinking about Jesse, like in 1973 at that house on the Marina Peninsula, I'm sitting there with him. I can just see the piano. He used to love to play piano. He could play really good blues piano. I'm there in the house with him, and he's playing piano or guitar, recalls his old bandmate Bob Glaub, whom Jesse mentored in the profession. His hands were big and strong, and that allowed him to manipulate his instrument in a very defining and provocative way, Jesse's graffiti bandmate Mark Shark explains. He didn't play no bullshit. He didn't like the dog and pony show. He wanted what he played to be real and to evoke emotion. No one played like Jesse, Jim Keltner insists. He was one of only 2 people in my life I would call brilliant, a bona fide genius, the other being jazz bassist Albert Stinson, who also died young from a drug overdose. Davis's widow, Kelly Brady, insisted that he should first be celebrated as a musician. The fact that he was Indian, it had nothing to do with that, and he never thought it did. You know, music is one thing, and a powwow is another. A lot of people, he was a great guitarist for an Indian. No. He was a great guitarist who happened to be an Indian. He didn't equate one thing with the other. But that shouldn't suggest that his indigeneity wasn't important in worlds where Native people were not visible or audible. Taj Mahal recalls a gig that they played in Taos in the late 1960s. Hippies had recently descended on the town with painted VW buses, yoga studios, and health food stores. There was real tension with the local Taos Pueblo, who resented and avoided their uninvited guests, except on this occasion. When the band returned from dinner, the promoter was panicked. "You looked like a ghost," remembers Taj, who was worried no one bought tickets. In fact, the place was packed. Young Pueblo kids filled the first 5 rows. The elders had met to discuss whether to allow the kids to all go in town together for the concert. They heard there was a Native brother in the group. They came out to see him get down. Seeing a touring Native American musician was an event. Jesse's story ends in tragedy, but his life was filled with comedy. He had a great sense of humor. In 1970, concluding sessions for his first solo album, he called everyone out to the studio floor and told them to sit down cross-legged for an Indian chant. Everyone was into it, including Clapton. Jesse, in a large black cowboy hat, started to sing in some indigenous language. Minutes passed, everyone enthusiastically chanting along, eyes closed, when Jesse suddenly busted up laughing. "I'm just fucking with you. We're not doing an Indian chant. You were all singing, 'I have a banana in my ear.'" Or take the time Jesse went to the LA County Courthouse to be married to Kelly in front of the same judge who used to lock him up. He invited Jackson Browne to be his best man. There he was, Browne recalls, clean and straight, sober, and the judge was really, well, you could see that the judge liked him in a sort of judge magisterial kind of gruff way, saying, "Well, Mr. Davis, I see that you've really turned the corner here." It's like a scene from a film. In 1970, when Jesse introduced himself to the world with his first solo album, he quite literally packaged himself in humor. That's him sitting cross-legged, smoking a salami in a tie-dye tee and cut-off jean shorts on the back cover of his first album. And that's him or some historical analog of him in his father's vibrant front cover painting of a Native guy smoking a calumet. They're mirror images, one serious, one satire, but both depictions of young Native people facing their futures. "Paradise opened wide," Jesse sang. Perhaps he didn't imagine new indigenous futures as much as he filled them. But like his guitar playing, he preserved a certain amount of space and a style more careful than cautious. He played fearlessly, but he always knew how to find his way back. Until one day he didn't. Davis's story is unique, but certain riffs tell a recognizable story. One that is a 20th century Native American story, a rock and roll story, and an Oklahoma story. And through these interwoven tales comes an invitation to think more creatively about whom we do and don't see as important Native American historical subjects, and what they can tell us about Native people's experiences in the 20th century, as they commanded attention from a portion of flyover country that is equal parts Southern, Southwestern, Western, Midwestern, Great Plains, and none of the above. Above all, this is a human story, because it requires interpreting Indigenous peoples first and foremost through a lens of humanity, as John Trudell wanted. And how better to tell a human story than through the universal language of music? So here's one more human story. Until his death, Jesse always stayed in touch with his high school and college girlfriend, briefly his fiancée, Mary Carol Kasperite. Sometimes he would call her at night just to check in, to revisit some time or place or someone who could bring him out of the Los Angeles fog. He always referred to an old mansion on Oklahoma City's Pennsylvania Avenue that used to be the estate for a large plot of farmland and is now a bank headquarters, crowded by fast food restaurants. The house was owned by two real estate developers and art collectors who got caught in a kidnapping plot involving their daughter and resulted in the father's murder. When Jesse saw this place growing up, it was marked by thick trees, gravel roads, fish ponds, hen houses, cattle, and barns. He dreamed of moving back to Oklahoma City, buying that place, and leaving Los Angeles behind. Wherever he went, however far, Oklahoma always called him home. Indeed, Jesse is still out there somewhere. Turn on your radio and you'll find him. Thinking about mortality, he once said, "Trudell and I are amongst the Indians that believe there is another reality beyond the last breath we take in life. If I ever reach him, he'll probably laugh at the notion of some dude from Oklahoma writing a book about him. If he was resolute about one thing, it was this: you don't sit around and talk about what you're going to play. And you don't write it down on a chart. That's not how you make music, at least not where he came from. So, at the expense of returning to the theme of what Jesse was not, he liked to preserve some breathing room in his playing and producing. He didn't like clutter and self-indulgence. Not in his art, anyway. So let's clear that from the mix, mute those tracks, and create some space for his song to breathe. Who was Jesse Ed Davis? When he sang it, it went like this. Ain't no Beatle, ain't no Rolling Stone, ain't an Okie from Muskogee. I'm just a red dirt boogie brother all the time. Okay, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for joining me for that. It was a pleasure to share it with you. I hope you liked it. And yeah, I look forward to sharing this as a book one day soon. Thank you very much.